Okay, now our next presenter is Harriet Cunningham. So, Harriet, while I'm introducing you, hi, please feel free to share your screen. That's, and I'll just... So, Harriet Cunningham is a writer based in Sydney, Australia, best known as an arts journalist and music and theatre critic for the Sydney Morning Herald. She holds a PhD in cultural history and creative writing from UTS and an MA Honours English Literature and Latin from Edinburgh University. Her research interests include music and modernism in post-war Britain, writing about music and creative history. And she's also been known to play the violin as well. So there's a little connection. So Harriet, over to you.
Great, thank you. Right, well, hello, and first of all, I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people, traditional owners of this land, and reaffirm that it's a land which was never ceded and it was taken by force. And thank you for the grace and custodianship and for welcoming us here. Now, this paper steps back from the hands-on challenges of programming classical music to take a historical view of programming and to reflect on the impact of innovative programming on creative trajectories and what studying historical programming can teach us today. I'm using a case study of the early years of the Dartington International Summer School of Music, which was a festival held on a medieval estate in rural Devon, some 250 miles from London in the UK. Its artistic director was the writer, performer, and arts impresario, William Glock. As legend would have it, the festival was dreamt up around a post-concert dinner at the inaugural Edinburgh Festival. At this dinner, the pianist Arthur Schnabel, who was Glock's teacher and mentor, tasked Glock with creating a festival which might go beyond the normal fare of grand opera and Viennese classics and introduce a more democratic, a more participatory element. And so within a year of Schnabel's laying down the gauntlet, Glock launched the International Summer School of Music, a festival bringing together professionals, amateurs, students, and teachers, and it's still running today. But right now, I'm going to take us back in time. I'm going to set the scene. I'm going to go back, in fact, before the war to set the scene for classical music in post-war Britain and give a broad overview of the early years from 1948 to 59, and then zoom in on some photos and a couple of concert programs to have a look at what's going on. And then maybe throw down some challenges. So I hope you can see the programs here on the screen. This is January the 2nd, 1931, and this is the Radio Times. Oh, wrong page. So music and music performance underwent huge changes in the early part of the 20th century, not least because of technology, broadcasting, the BBC, performances out of the concert hall and into your living room. So this program, you can see there's news and there's children's hour and there's a lecture and a vaudeville act and a tango orchestra. And at 9:35, Arnold Schoenberg pops up. He's conducting the BBC orchestra playing Erwartung. It's a perfect example of what the BBC controller, John Reith, called mixed programming. It was his policy that listeners were served up a variety of programs, so news, drama, sport, religion, all on the one channel. And okay, this was partly because there was only one channel at this point, but it does have far-reaching implications. It brought a wide range of interests together in one place so that listeners tuning in for the news would also hear music or drama or sports, which were otherwise only accessed by niche audiences. And conversely, it put a general audience in contact with niche subjects. It was therefore what media scholar Paddy Scannell called a fundamentally democratic thrust of broadcasting. So the other picture on the right is from September 1939. The adventurous programming faltered somewhat with the outbreak of war. As you can imagine, there were restrictions on travel, displaced artists, bombed out venues, disrupted lives, and frankly, a narrowing of options for programming music. William Glock wrote in Horizon in 1940 that since 1939, audiences have wished, not unnaturally, to be sustained rather than challenged by the music they heard. 4 years later, the editor of Horizon, Cyril Connolly, was much more scathing, noting a decline in all the arts. Reviewing has sunk to polite blurb quoting, "The BBC pumps religion and patriotism into all its programmes. Mediocrity triumphs." It was this sense of mediocrity, of being separate from the world, which drove a sense of urgency to rebuild and reestablish connections after the war and to recreate the cultural network. And this resulted in a dramatic flowering of arts activity in Britain immediately post-war. So in all my pages are mixed up. So in 1947, the first Edinburgh Festival took place. And in the summer of 1948, Benjamin Britten started the Aldborough Festival in a fishing town on the Sussex coast. And at much the same time, William Glock launched the Bryanston Music Summer School at a boarding school in Dorset. And that's where my study begins. So let's look at the week one of the first ever summer school. I hope you can read these programs a little bit. And of note, Sunday, August the 1st, this is the very first lecture session. And it is from Imogen Holst, and it's How to Listen. I mean, talk about starting at the very beginning. Then we go straight into the English lute song. Later in the week, we have Alfred Deller, who's a countertenor, one of the first singers who identified as a countertenor rather than a male alto, singing music from the English Renaissance. And then also later in the week, Nadia Boulanger lecturing on Stravinsky, followed up by 2 performances of the duo concertanti. And this was very deliberate. There were 2 performances so that you could hear it a second time, reflect in between, go to the lecture, really get your head around it. And this was in fact part of the fairly evangelical retrospective that William Glock was presenting, which was an introduction to the 4 major influences in contemporary music, which he felt was Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Hindemith, and Bartók. And there was a week devoted to each. And Paul Hindemith was there for his week. So this wasn't a bluffer's guide or a superficial skim across the landscape. It was a really deep dive. And there were also lectures from prominent writers and philosophers, Elias Canetti, E.M. Forster, Wyndham Lewis. It was seriously intellectual. So the summer school moved to Dartington Hall in 1953, and by then it counted amongst its regular guests composers like Boris Blascher, Georges Enescu, right at the end of his life, came and gave some apparently life-changing lectures and performances, the Amadeus String Quartet, and the brilliant and tragic Australian pianist Noel Newton Wood. The facilities at Dartington, which included a 13th century banqueting hall with ideal acoustics for chamber music, gave the summer school room to spread out, and not just spatially. What started as a generalist course, mirroring more or less conservatorium type offerings of musicianship and analysis and performance, became more and more adventurous year by year. And I shall show you some photos and to give you an idea. So this is Thea Musgrave, and she was at Dartington in 53 and onwards, leading the composing courses. Early music was well represented by people like Thurston Dart and Rosalind Turek. There was conducting. Hermann Scherchen came out in 54 to teach conducting and to take the choir, and apparently he was terrifying. Oh yes, folk music. I don't know whether anyone in the hall recognizes these. These are Morris dancers, a traditional English folk tradition. And you get hit over the head with that balloon if you're bad. This is 1955, and as far as I can tell, it's the very first year, the very first time anywhere in the world that there was a course on writing for film music, and that was taken by Roman Vlad, who's on the left, talking here to Roger Sessions and Roberto Gerhardt. In 1957, the star guest was Igor Stravinsky with his entourage. And in 1958, that's Raymond Leopard and Peter Pears are in the middle there, and Aaron Copland, and yeah, his name's gone, but he's a very famous musician. Manute Parikian, that's it. So the summer school in these years had a exploding frame of reference. The repertoire and the performance practices were informed by the Western canon, but rapidly pushing beyond it to early music, and even new kinds of music. And this expansive development of scope reached a peak in 1959. Here's an extract from the prospectus. So you can see halfway down on the left, there's Mark Wilkinson is giving a course on electronic music. He's one of the founding members of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Luigi Nono is there teaching composition with Peter Maxwell Davies as interpreter. Safford Cape is inviting amateur musicians to learn about how to play early music. And there's a course for Western musicians to learn Chinese music. So at a time when the field of ethnomusicology was in its infancy, when early music and original instruments were pretty much novelties, and when synthesizers and tapes and computer-generated noises were less than a decade old, the teaching program represents an unprecedented range of musical investigations. Now, talking of programming, let's have a closer look at some of the repertoire. And I hope you can see up at the top left, Charles Rosen's piano recital. It covers a huge amount of ground. Bach, Stravinsky, well, Bach to Milton Babbitt is impressive. In fact, this program reminds me of the kind of program that Ji Liu was presenting this morning, where he picks up so beautifully on themes between works from vastly different periods, reflecting on each of them. Then later in the week, Safford Cape doing music from the Renaissance. Thursday was a big event. It was the UK premiere of Pierre Boulez's Le Marteau sans Maître, with people like Cornelius Cardew and Richard Bennett making up a crack team of new music players. The following night, there was a premiere of Benjamin Britten's, a new arrangement of Benjamin Britten's A Boy Was Born, conducted by the composer. So the repertoire is really broad-ranging, and it's drawn from across 7 centuries, and it's integrated across the whole week. And here are some images. So there's Britain on the bottom left, with choral director George Malcolm and some of the boys from the Westminster Choir, and Luigi Nono top right with Maxwell Davies. And of course, the legend goes that Britain asked to be introduced to Nono, and Nono declined. Bottom right is Stefan Volper, and next to that, his daughter, Katerina Volper. And over from them, the 2 women sitting talking is Elizabeth Lutchins and writer Susan Bradshaw. And this actually brings up for me a series of things I'd like you to notice here. The firstly, that the gender diversity. This is really not a boys' club, or not entirely so. Women have a platform. They have a platform as virtuosos, like Caterina Volpe, who's a piano virtuoso. They have a platform as experts and as leaders, like Susan Bradshaw and Liz Lutchins. In quantitative terms, the stats for repertoire by music is not great. It is the 1950s, but it's way more than zero, which is much more than comparable programs at that time. Another thing to observe, cultural diversity. Now, I am cherry picking here. There are not a lot of people of color in the photos, but almost half the artists come from overseas, from many different cultures, many representing the marginalized diaspora of Europeans displaced by war. Stefan Volpe, for instance, or the Amadeus Quartet, many Armenians. Then there's also, in the top left-hand corner, you can see the woman on the far left. That's Gloria Davy, who was the first woman of color to sing Aida at the New York Met. And next to those, the Kwong Kwong duo. That's two expatriate artists from Shanghai and Hong Kong, a violin and piano duo, talking to Manute Parikian. I'd also like to observe the visibility of liminal figures. I've mentioned women and I've mentioned displaced people and refugees. You can also see many wheelchairs and people with disabilities in the photos. This is in the middle is the management team in 1960, and the woman in the center is Bea Musson, who was actually ran the show basically for 3 decades. And also noting that homosexuality was still a criminal act in the UK at this time, there are many discrete but openly gay or non-heteronormative figures. I'm not making assumptions from these photos, but you might be able to see just on the handmade poster on the right, the bullish words, Boulez, at last, for the first time in gay Britain. So we have in this festival a fairly unique set of conditions. There's mixed programming. So there's a program where you're really encouraged to listen to unfamiliar music alongside familiar music. There's a range of repertoire, which is much greater than what you'd hear in most concert halls. There's a culturally diverse cohort, artists from the US, Australia, Asia, Europe, and South Africa. There's a juxtaposition of tradition and the new. I love the fact that there's something rather delicious about premiering Boulez in a 13th century banqueting hall. And it's what William Glock likes to call creative unbalance. And what I have identified as the modernist writer Susan Stanford Friedman's concept of an intensified contact zone, meaning that the summer school is a place where things and people and things meet, not to homogenize or categorize, but to inform and transform each other. So the implication is that collision is creative and that difference is a powerful force for new thinking. An environment informed by this kind of intensified contact zone has significant implications for diversity, tolerance, and creativity on a broader stage. As James Clifford says, cultural action, the making and remaking of identities, takes place in the contact zones along the policed and transgressive intercultural frontiers of nations, peoples, locales. So what? How does this impact on reimagining musical programming today? I'm not the first person in these fascinating few days to make these points, but I think by this time we're all in agreement that programming really matters. It matters because it changes people, it changes lives, it changes the way people think. Listening to Chris Cody talking about the legacy of Booker T. Washington in New Orleans took me straight to the same space as the summer school. So many participants at Dartington in the 1950s went on to be inspired and to make a lasting impact on music in Britain in the second half of the 20th century. Here's a few examples. First of all, of course, later Sir William Glock, who was appointed controller of music at the BBC in this same year, 1959. And he took over programming of the Proms and the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and he even managed to smuggle in Boulez as the chief conductor of the BBC Symphony, which put the cat amongst the pigeons. Here's Richard Rodney Bennett next to him, who, of course, is a Oscar award-winning film music composer, knighted for services to music. Next to that is a very young and angry-looking Peter Maxwell Davies, who, of course, later became the Master of the Queen's Music in 2004. And we've met this woman before. This is Thea Musgrave, one of the summer school's first composition teachers. Programming also matters because it gives us a fascinating insight into cultural history. And if we accept that music and the arts have a power which endures beyond the time or place-based limits in which they're experienced, then we acknowledge that they have the power to change people, to change society. So programming is culturally and politically significant. It leaves a mark, and it's therefore a responsibility. It matters also because this power is not only in the hands of the artist or the maker, but it's often in the hands of the curator, the arts professional, the festival director, radio programmer, critic, as they exercise control over the transmission of art from maker to receiver. They mediate art's power to transform minds. And these are things I think about as I make my way through life as a writer, an artist, and not least a music critic. And as I observe the clear lack of policy for the arts in Australia and the political nature of appointments to major arts organisations, funding bodies, and advisory panels. More importantly, I observe the takeover of curation and programming of content in today's largest arena, the internet, by search engines designed to narrow one's focus, to exclude diversity and feed the creation of personal canons. Sometimes the curation is transparent with the suggestion of, if you liked X, you might like Y, but more often it's invisible, making decisions about what content you see and what content you don't, leading you into an ever-narrowing channel of taste. It's the antithesis of the intensified contact zone. It's undemocratic and it's polarizing, and it excludes the less powerful voices which frequently, by their very circumstances, are operating in conditions which must respond to the challenges of change and modernity with unique insight and creativity. So, reimagining musical programming, I argue, is an opportunity and it's a responsibility. And I'm just going to leave us here with these questions and say that reprogramming is about giving a platform not just to the loudest voices and for learning to listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. And hopefully you can hear the warm applause in the room, and I'm sure with the traditional hand clapping emojis on Zoom as well. If you don't mind, can you if you stop sharing, then we'll be able to see the other.
Yes.
The other Zoom.
Hang on. Zoom. Hang on. Stop share. There we go. Got it.
Thanks so much. And I'll just. Great. Okay. Well, that was fantastic. Loved it. I love how you use this quite specific example of Dartington to then zoom out and look at some much broader issues. So that was really, really wonderfully done. We have a question already from Chris Cody. I will take the microphone to him right now.
Thank you so much, Harriet. That was a really fascinating presentation, and I learned a lot. My question, I'm wondering, given the real diversity of this program, Do you have a sense of why no modern jazz artists are included or seem to have been included? And I ask that because, you know, the Donaueschingen, I'm pronouncing that wrong, but the big German modern classical music festival in the 1950s is, it's a real hub actually of modern jazz performance. They start joining that program. And so I was just struck. So it's clearly something that's happening in the intellectual world of Europeans thinking about expanding programming practices. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment about that at all.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was a small representation of jazz musicians, and there were also, but it absolutely wasn't a focus. And I suspect that was partly, well, I was going to say part of William Glock's taste, but actually William Glock was famous for overcoming his own personal tastes and programming music which he didn't like, and that was part of what he was encouraging us to do. There was certainly much more jazz in later years, and it's become a great center for improvisation and jazz in later years. In the 50s, not sure.
We have a question from Miff Turpin here.
Sort of following on from that, what does the summer schools operate today, and how does its programming repertoire look like today, if it still goes?
Yeah, it does operate today. Probably some people may even have been. It's obviously under different artistic directorship. One of the unique things about the location, though, is that Dartington is actually the site of a progressive school, and so historically has always been part of. Has always been a place which welcomed refugees and experimental ideas, and that really resonates through the program of the summer school and has remained a touchstone for it. So the latest, so Joanna McGregor has been the director for the last 5 years and has expanded it, you know, beyond to multi-genre, so very much anything from Herbie Flowers to dance music to choral singing to pop music, all sorts, and always with an emphasis on the experimental as well.
Any more questions in the room or on Zoom? I might ask one quickly, Harriet. I was just wondering how much you think, or how much people talk at the time, this relates to a sense of Englishness, in the sense that you mentioned the proms and you mentioned radio programming, and that particular sense of Englishness that, you know, that experimental music should be available for, you know, because the proms always program contemporary music as well as all the big hits, you know, so there's kind of that mixed programming. Was that sort of talked about, this connects to a sense of English identity in some way?
I started out my doctoral research really thinking about this, thinking about the English look to, of course, not the 1950s Britain, but I gradually found that it was less and less relevant, because actually the real push of the summer school was to try and move away from the idea of Englishness and also, you know, into a sort of post-colonial view on art and culture, to try and get away from the whole imagined nations. And you know, you see it in the very first program. They're trying to define, you know, the specific people that you need to listen to, but that very soon is thrown out in preference of actually just giving everyone a platform.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, thank you so much, yeah, for a really interesting presentation, and please join me in the room and on Zoom for thanking Harriet one more time.